Hello, friends. Many years ago, I was preparing to give a talk, a Sunday service sermon, the following day. And since I lived just a short drive from the ocean at that time, the Pacific Ocean in California, I went to spend a few hours along the ocean by the beach, just quietly by myself. It was not a popular place. It was rather more of a windswept dunes kind of area. But anyway, I found a place kind of secluded, protected with various dunes and hills around, and kind of snuggled in to read a little bit and meditate and just kind of consider the thoughts I was wanted to share the following day. And as I was doing so, I was lying down, face down towards the sand, flat, and reading and kind of looking down at the sand just ahead of the book. And so my field of vision was a square foot at the most, really more like half that, 6 inches by 6 inches or something. And into the middle of my little world that I was looking at of sand in front of me popped a little ant. Just came crawling right up out of the middle of it and walked around in it for a while, and I either walked out of my field of vision or walked back down into the sand. I don't remember which. But anyway, so I got to thinking about Mr. Ant and Mr. Me looking at Mr. Ant and realizing that as far as he was concerned, this was his home. This was his yard. This was his whatever you might think. It was where he was supposed to be in that moment. I don't think that he was particularly aware of me looming not more than a foot or two above him. And he himself, I assume, now have never made a study of how long ants live. I have a kind of an intuitive sense that it's not very long. So Mr. Ant has probably moved on to ant heaven or whatever that may be, the equivalent. He occupied that space for a short period of time. And relative to him, maybe it seemed like a huge area. I know that over the years I have gone back to visit old schools. I remember visiting the gymnasium that I had physical education classes, gym classes in when I was a little kid, probably in grade school. And at the time it seemed enormous. I remember the baskets for the basketball were the standard 10 feet high, and to a little kid they seemed like they were 20 feet high. I mean, it was huge. Going back there, it seemed so small. It was like, wow, it was almost like I wasn't even in the same building. And so perspective changes depending on our own perception, depending on our own evolution, depending on our own awareness of broader realities. For the ant, maybe that little patch of ground was basically his entire existence. I really don't know. I know for me it was just a little tiny patch of real estate. I spent a little time there that day. I don't believe I ever went back to that same place again. And I'm reminded of something that Swami Kriyananda said a number of times when we moved to India with him in 2003, early 2004. He spoke to the groups of Indians that came to hear him, and he would sometimes say to them, "You all are moving through a time zone. We, meaning us Westerners who had come there, are moving through a space zone, meaning that we have come in our perception, we have come across the planet to this place, India, to spend time and to be in this other place. You all, Indians, are moving through a time zone because India is your home. You don't relate to it as going somewhere else. You occupy a period of years in this place. And so for you, it's a time zone that you move through. And really, for all of us, we don't, time and space are entirely relative to what we're working with. In that moment with the ant, I was looking at a small little patch of real estate. But, I used to build, in that era, I used to build homes for a living. And I can tell you that a home, in the grand scheme of the world, is a tiny, tiny little piece of real estate. For the people who are building it or are going to live in it, it's an enormously important thing. It's hugely expensive to build a home. For most people, it's the single most expensive thing that they will ever purchase in their lives. Whether they build it, have it built, or whether it's already built and they go to live in it, buy it and live in it, or rent it and live in it. It's the single biggest outlay of energy that they will have in their lives. For most people, not everyone obviously, but for most people. And so it assumes this enormous degree of importance. And yet, I think back to the home that I grew up in, which was a nice home in a nice neighborhood, not a fancy, elegant, opulent sort of neighborhood, but a decent middle class, maybe upper middle class kind of neighborhood. And that home has been sold decades since, and other families have moved in. I don't know how many. It's been remodeled, it's been changed. The trees in the yard are mostly gone, many of them replaced. The garage has been replaced. I mean, it's a very different look to it in certain ways. I can still easily recognize it because the basic shape is there. But I wouldn't, yes, I can remember that home well, but I can't sort of claim it as my own. It's just, it represents a time in my life growing up when I lived there, when our family lived there. And there are happy memories associated with that. But it's not something that we can ever hold on to. We may think that we can. We may get attached to those kinds of places, those kinds of identifications. And to a degree, it helps us. It sort of centers us in a certain reality, a certain level of security and sense of place in the universe. But we can never hang on to those things. They don't belong to our soul. Because sooner or later we move on. We, all of us, are moving through a time zone, and at a certain point we move on. We move on beyond this body, this world, this personality, these circumstances. I've watched a number of people in their elder years, I'm talking in their 80s, 90s, who have more or less outlived their friends and kind of peers. And there's a sadness in that, and particularly for the ones who haven't made friends with younger generations, so they don't kind of have a connection to the world as it is now. It's like they start to lose the sense of place. They lose that sense of connectedness to life, and then sooner or later they move on. But I'm convinced that part of that moving on is that sense of, I no longer fit. I no longer fit. The world that I grew up in, that I'm somewhat attached to, somehow no longer applies in the same way. So I would invite all of us, as we move through the time zones and space zones of life, to hold on to them lightly, to realize that we have them for a time. They are ours to appreciate, to enjoy, to learn from, to as a backdrop for the growth that will dominate our lives, that will inform our lives, that will invigorate and um, energize our lives. But they're not for us to be attached to. Because if we get attached, then there's inevitably pain at the end of that attachment. And we've been through that. We've all been around that block and we know it fairly well. So hold on to those places and times lightly in order that we be able to fully embrace the present. Because by doing so, we can live in joy and we can live in freedom. Namaste.